Llama a las 9 de la noche y ordena el ataque a un hospital.
Tuvo que ser evacuado hasta un hospital de las inmediaciones. Desde allí, comentó que el país atravesaba un intento de golpe de Estado.
Mate a correr y sacar esa protesta.
¿Quién te lo hubiese contado?
La necesidad de tener acceso a tecnología en el área de información en los países de Latinoamérica se hace cada vez mayor. TeleSUR presenta Satélites en América Latina, un seriado informativo que evidencia las ventajas sociales y económicas de tener acceso a un satélite en órbita. Conozca las posibilidades y alcances que brindan los satélites en América Latina, de lunes a viernes, solo por TeleSUR.
A esta hora los temas informativos de TeleSUR. El movimiento Occupy Wall Street alista nuevas movilizaciones por su primer aniversario. Para este lunes se anuncia una manifestación en los alrededores de la Bolsa de Valores de Nueva York. Los candidatos en Venezuela intensifican la campaña electoral a 21 días de comicios presidenciales. El Papa Benedicto XVI concluye su visita al Líbano. Durante la última jornada insistió en llamados a la paz y al diálogo entre religiones. Siguen las protestas en distintos países de Europa y Medio Oriente contra la película considerada ofensiva por los musulmanes. La policía sudafricana detiene la avanzada de una nueva protesta pacífica de mineros. Los trabajadores piden el fin de la violencia y respuestas por la masacre de la mina Maricana. Los detalles de estas informaciones en próximos espacios.
Yo estaba durmiendo, eran aproximadamente a las 6 de la mañana. Y recuerdo haber escuchado como que alguien estaba forzando la cerradura. Estaba rodeado de personas con ametralladoras, cascos y todo lo que se ha visto en las películas. Me esposaron y me revisaron la boca. Parece que habían visto muchas películas de James Bond y pensaban que iba a tener cianuro en la boca o algo. Y me dijeron que estaba arrestado, ¿no? Le pregunté por qué. No, tú sabes por qué.
Cubans busted here in the United States spying for Fidel. Are they terrorists or freedom fighters?
Excuse me, sir. Do you know who the Cuban Five are?
Weren't they those guys that played the U.S. in the semifinals of the Pan American Games in the basketball tournament?
You know what the Cuban Five are? The Cuban Five are 5 men who are defending their country against terrorism.
Oh, yeah, the Cuban Five. Are they that salsa band?
Americans? No, they're Cubans.
Why haven't I ever heard about that?
The Cuban Five? They're that rock band, right?
Hey, I mean, you know who the Cuban Five are? Well, you want to find out?
No, don't take a picture of me, please. Okay.
All right, the police looking for you? What they did was they infiltrated terrorist groups in Miami of exiles, which were planning attacks on the Cuban people and foreign citizens inside Cuba. The Cuban Five have a right to defend the Cuban Revolution.
Oh, the Cuban Revolution? No, that's before my time.
The story of the Cuban Five began more than 50 years ago. In 1957, I was a university student, and I discovered that kids my age were fighting a guerrilla war in Cuba. I read the story in the New York Times. The rebels were led by a young lawyer, Fidel Castro. The U.S. government backed a loyal and very anti-communist dictator, Fulgencio Batista.
We have struck the spark of the revolution. We gladly suffer cold and rain and the hardship of life in the mountain. This is only the beginning. The last battle will be fought in the capital.
We are trying to eliminate poverty and unemployment, two conditions which are always exploited by the communists.
Aquel era un mundo despiadado. Ese tratamiento despiadado a la gente era en todos los ámbitos, en todos los aspectos. Desde el maestro con el alumno, el patrono con los obreros, el dueño de la tierra con el otro. Ese era el comerciante con el cliente. Y aquel era un mundo despiadado. Yo aquel mundo lo conozco perfectamente bien.
Yo soy de la generación de Castro. Era presidente del Colegio de Contadores. Estábamos en contra de del dictador de Batista. Entonces todo el mundo estaba, todas las clases vivas, todos los profesionales, los industriales, etc., estaban en contra de Batista.
Life was good before Castro.
My father was an executive in a U.S. sugar corporation in Havana.
I had a boat, a motorboat, a speedboat. I had many girlfriends. I was a high middle class member of a family in which I had anything and everything that you could possibly have.
My grandmother took me to Cuba, to Havana. It was just before the revolution. I'll never forget my very astute grandmother telling me, a 13-year-old, watch out for the prostitutes and the gambling houses.
Que esta ciudad había sido tomada por el sindicato del crimen organizado, que había empezado a fabricar los hoteles, estos mismos hoteles que tú ves hoy en La Habana.
The hotels here are bigger and swankier than any of the rough joints we put in Vegas. These are wonderful things that we've achieved in Havana. And we can thank our friends in the Cuban government. We have now what we have always needed, real partnership with the government. Smaller piece.
That scene in the Godfather 2 where they're dividing the cake, I don't know if it actually took place, and I don't know if they cut up a cake. They had cut up the country, yeah. Gambling, for sure. Prostitution, quite a bit.
Who would have believed that such a ragtag operation could succeed? But it did.
Nosotros los cubanos nos empezaron a conocer como cubanos a partir de esa fecha. Es una fecha para nosotros de dignidad, de patriotismo, de soberanía. Y una de las medidas importantes que va a hacer la revolución en esas primeras semanas después del triunfo es precisamente cerrar estos antros, estos garitos, estos casinos. Y por supuesto esto va a traer también la airada protesta de las autoridades norteamericanas. la Revolución Cubana genera un proceso social de cambios. Eso trae a Miami una primera emigración donde están los corruptos y los torturadores de la dictadura de Batista.
Cuba tenía algunos problemas, no lo negamos. Problemas políticos a veces, pero todos esos problemas eran resolvibles. Esto que tenemos ahora es lo que ha sido lamentable, porque se ha destruido el sistema que había en un país totalmente, se ha destruido la república aquella que no era perfecta, pero era perfectible.
A medida que se acercan las elecciones presidenciales, el actual gobierno de los Estados Unidos no ha logrado solventar las consecuencias de la recesión económica.
After college, I moved right back home. Not that I wasn't ready to move out just yet. I didn't have a job lined up.
Tampoco los medios hablan de sus secuelas. En esta edición, USA de Verdad te revela la cruda realidad de las tasas de desempleo en el país y de la prostitución en California. Solo por TeleSUR. TeleSUR, la señal informativa de América Latina.
My father was a colonel in Cuba, and he left the night that President Batista left. I remember I was 7 years old when Castro came to power, and I remember mobs outside my home. Our house was ransacked, we were searched constantly. So that's the image that I have of the revolution. People were being imprisoned, the fact that people were being, everything was taken away from them without trials or without a reason.
The revolutionary prosecutor had presented evidence that the men on trial had participated in torturing tens of thousands and killing some 20,000 people suspected of anti-Batista activities.
Dime que no. Te sentaste a contarme cómo la habías matado. Dime que no. Dímelo, Capiño.
No puedo contestar.
I remember one case that caused a very bad impression on everybody, including me. And there was a former colonel in the Batista army, Sosa Blanco. He was accused of having participated in murders by the Batista army that was tried at the sports city. And the sports city was full of people yelling. The impression was, by all standards, that is a crazy kind of court case.
The Revolutionary Court acquitted thousands of former Batista police and military officials, but executed some 500 others.
And this was very common in Cuba at the beginning of the revolution. So this is why it's so hard for this community. The Cuban-American community is made up of victims.
Some former Batista military and police officials launched attacks from Miami, trying to bring down the revolutionary government.
Y va a comenzar de manera directa. Es decir, no fueron solo declaraciones. En esos días, alrededor del 20, 21, 22 de octubre de 1959, de Estados Unidos vinieron varios aviones B-26 a bombardear la ciudad de La Habana. Y desde fechas muy tempranas no nos quedó otra opción que, además de denunciar las acciones que conocíamos que estaban planeándose, pues enviar a nuestra gente allí.
Cuba complained to Washington about allowing Cuban exiles to use South Florida bases to bomb the island. Secretary of State Christian Herter raised the issue with the president. Eisenhower responded, "Why don't the Cubans just shoot the planes down?" But Eisenhower didn't stop the raids, and Cuba began heavier infiltration of its agents into the violent groups in Miami.
Después viene una segunda migración en los 60, la propia burguesía nacional cubana que viene hacia los Estados Unidos.
What came in 1960, 1961, 1962, and so forth, were the business class, that obviously were against the government, and the more nationalizations took place, the more they became convinced, the professionals, and the middle class. These were the guys who were representatives of U.S. companies in Cuba before the revolution, or if they had their own companies, they had very well business connections established with the United States.
Si no, vienen a los Estados Unidos, vienen a Miami, un clima muy similar al de Cuba, a que los norteamericanos les resuelvan el problema.
Cuba has been one of our finest friends, and we have had a long history of friendly relationships, and we've tried to keep our hands out of their internal political affairs. We have not tried to...
In March 1960, President Eisenhower ordered the CIA to launch a covert operation to overthrow the Cuban government. It would be based in Miami and use Cuban exiles as the shock troops.
They were recruited and trained by the U.S. government, and the idea was to support them in overthrowing Castro, to get rid of this communist that has sprung up like a weed in our hemisphere.
The Miami station, codenamed JM Wave, was the second largest in the world outside of the headquarters in Langley. So you can imagine what kind of tentacles that had throughout the community with case officers for Cubans and whatnot.
Miami was essentially like I fantasized Casablanca was during the World War, during the Second World War.
Nobody was concerned about the influence of the CIA in Miami in those days because, as I say, the Cold War was at its peak. There was this undercurrent of intrigue, Cuban exiles plotting to do it on their own or plotting to do it with the CIA station.
Que al principio fue de apoyo a la revolución de Castro, después dije, no, este señor es un dictador. Primero pensé que era un dictador, y después pensé que ya era un dictador comunista. Ya yo me había destacado en luchar contra Castro. El señor Maurice Bishop me vino a hablar a ver si yo quería cooperar con él. Me procuró que quería hacer un almuerzo conmigo y fuimos al restaurante Floridita. Él me dijo, yo trabajo para un servicio de inteligencia. No me quiso decir quién era, pero era evidente que era la CIA. Porque el interés de él era crear lo que era una guerra psicológica, crear un rumor para que la gente tomara más miedo del gobierno y se opusiera más, era destabilizar el gobierno, que era una ley que era falsa, pero que la gente creyó en ella, que la patria potestad iba a pasar al Estado. Se creó un pánico tremendo. Eso dio origen después a una campaña que se llamaba Pedro Pan.
I was 13 years old. By the fall of 1960, the Central Intelligence Agency decided that it was in the interest of the United States to get children of the upper middle class out of Cuba.
We call it here Pedro Pan, they call it in Cuba Peter Pan. A project put together by the Catholic Church with assistance from the CIA, no question about it.
Vinieron como 15,000 muchachos.
So my grandfather, being a high executive with Standard Oil Cuba, was one of the executives who was first alerted that this was a possibility.
The parents of a friend of mine asked me, would you want to go to the United States? The U.S. government would pay for everything.
And he and my mother made probably the most difficult decision they have ever made in their life, that they would rather see me gone than be brought up in a system that they did not agree with.
Yo siempre después he pensado, fue correcto eso, porque efectivamente le creamos pánico al gobierno, pero también separamos a muchos muchachos de sus padres.
For many years, I was angry at my mother. There's no question about it. I was angry because I couldn't understand how somebody could make that type of decision.
By 1960, it became clear. The Cuban Revolution showed blatant disrespect, not only for Washington's policy preferences, but for private property in general.
Castro's followers bury American business and dump the symbolic caskets into the sea.
In early 1960, the Cold War entered the equation. When the Soviet Union offered to sell Cuba low-priced oil, Washington ordered the U.S. refineries in Cuba not to process it.
Quedan nacionalizadas todos los bienes, por supuesto, y empresas de la Texaco y de la ESO.
At his White House press conference, President Eisenhower announces that Cuba's assigned share of the United States sugar market has been cut in reply to what I call Fidel Castro's deliberate policy of hostility.
Compañía Cubana de Electricidad.
Castro responded by nationalizing all U.S. property in Cuba.
Dos, Compañía Cubana de Teléfonos. United Fruit Co.
Eisenhower imposed a commercial and credit embargo on Cuba. Under the radar, however, the CIA made a major change in its plan to overthrow the Cuban government.
The original plan for the Bay of Pigs was infiltration and set up, work with the guerrillas that were already operating, mostly in the Escambray and eastern Cuba. But then in November, the fall of '60, somebody decided to change the concept and recruit a lot more people and go in as a strike force.
Many of the participants in the Bay of Pigs were on that landing force because I had known them personally in Cuba. And I had recommended on a number of occasions that such and such a person would be a good man to have in the brigade.
I started training for the operation that later became Bay of Pigs. At the beginning, it was not going to be an invasion. It was going to be an insurrection from inside, using us as the spearhead.
On January 2nd, 1961, Fidel Castro called the U.S. Embassy a nest of spies.
There is a limit to what the United States in self-respect can endure. That limit has now been reached. Our friendship for the Cuban people is not affected.
And I will faithfully execute the office
of President of the United States.
Kennedy continued to pursue the covert plan to send a force of Cuban exiles to invade the island. I was in Cuba in 1961, and like everyone else there, I knew an invasion was coming. But where and when? I watched militiamen planting dynamite under bridges and installing anti-aircraft guns along the coast. CIA-backed exiles assassinated Cuban school teachers and militiamen. They burned cane fields and tried to sabotage sugar mills and oil refineries.
Es decir, la CIA daba explosivos, daba etacas incendiarias. El Encanto, la tienda principal y más importante de La Habana, fue quemada y destruida completamente.
Shortly before the invasion, Kennedy ordered that no U.S. air support be given to the invasion force.
The assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro.
Immediately, we got involved in the first firefight, which was a militia patrol that was guarding the city, or the little town of Playa Girón, and therefore after that we started moving inland until we found the first resistance.
Meanwhile, at the United Nations, Cuban Foreign Minister Roa accused the United States of unleashing a war of invasion. Roa says the invading soldiers trained in Florida, but Ambassador Stevenson makes a quick denial.
These charges are totally false, and I deny them categorically. The United States has committed no aggression against Cuba, and no offensive has been launched from Florida or from any other part of the United States.
At 1 a.m. in the morning of Wednesday the 19th, I was awakened by a call from the White House. It was Mac Bundy. He said, "I am in the President's office and he would like to have you come down here as soon as possible." When I arrived in the President's office, the President was concerned and sharp in his comment. It was increasingly clear, even with the breakdown of communication, that things were going badly on the beachhead, though no one knew how badly.
You could see the American ships in the horizon, and people were trying to get in whatever boats they could find to try to reach them. But the fact of the matter, there were too few boats, and there was just not enough time.
When that broadcast came from the beach, and the leader said, "We're standing in the water, and there's nothing else we can do," and he cursed.
We were inside the swamps on a little small mount, and we were looking at the beach, and then Fidel Castro was coming into the beach, sitting on top of a tank. For a few minutes, we were debating whether to take a shot at him and try to kill him. We had him in the sights. We could have very easily taken a shot.
It was a failed proposition to begin with, but I guess Kennedy was not altogether with the idea that the invasion should take place or that Castro should be deposed. So one day he decided to get rid of us, and that's precisely what he did.
Even if the revolution had not been communist or had not turned towards communism, the Americans would have still invaded. This was not a problem of ideology. It was a problem of interest being affected.
As the invasion collapsed, we were at a camp in a place called Kendall. The kids basically freaked out because now they came to the full realization that they're not going back home.
There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan.
The immediate mood in the White House in the weeks that followed the Bay of Pigs was a mixture of anger, frustration. There's little doubt then that our objective, ultimate objective, remained the same, which was the overthrow of the Cuban Revolution, of the Castro regime.
Dick Bissell's secretary called me and said, come on in, he wants to talk to you. And the first thing he said to me, Cuba is going to be reactivated. The president had me in his office with his brother, and they both attacked me for having sat on my ass since the Bay of Pigs and not done anything to, quote, get rid of Castro and the Castro regime, unquote. Those were the orders. My first question to him was, what does get rid of mean? His answer to me was very simple. Use your imagination.
We were told to dispose of Mr. Castro, and to the word dispose you can add anything you want.
Cuando fracasó Bahía Cochinos, se entendió que la única forma de vencer era ajusticiando al tirano, es decir, asesinando a Fidel Castro. Y entonces pues se hizo primero un intento en el Palacio Presidencial.
There were found some a suit, a wetsuit, a clamshell, various things that were on the shelf in the agency that were regarded as things that might be used in possibly killing Castro or being used against him, which never came off the shelf.
Yo fui reclutado por la CIA, el que estuvo a cargo de el coronel Harold Benson. Identificamos a Harold Benson en aquel momento, unos años después, como David Adley Phillips, que también se hizo llamar Maurice Bishop.
I had been stationed in Cuba in 1959, 58. I was there 59 and 60 before I had to leave rather abruptly. I had an affinity for Cuba. The Cuban people are marvelous.
En cada momento, en cada instante, su interés era Fidel. ¿Cuándo sale Fidel? ¿A dónde va Fidel? ¿Cuáles son los itinerarios de Fidel? Con la evidente intención de atentar contra la vida del comandante en jefe.
These operations against Cuba were known to the Attorney General of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, the President of the United States himself.
Castro could not defend against these attacks, so he tried diplomacy. In August 1961, he dispatched Che Guevara to meet with Kennedy's advisor, Richard Goodwin, in Uruguay. The two men met in secret, during which Che made it clear Cuba could loosen its ties with the Soviets, stop supporting revolution in Latin America, and compensate the American companies it had expropriated, if the United States would stop its aggressive behavior and resume trade with Cuba.
Kennedy was very interested, but the ruins of the Bay of Pigs for the United States were much too raw to think of beginning discussions at that point.
In the weeks following Cuba's diplomatic gesture, CIA-backed raids against Cuba increased. Castro then turned to a dramatic form of deterrence from Moscow. The Soviet Union began to secretly install nuclear missiles in Cuba.
John F. Kennedy was telling the people that there were no Russians in Cuba, and so we thought it was a good opportunity to show the world that yes, there were Russians in Cuba. I've liked cannons all my life. I bought a cannon for $300, so we went there in front of this hotel. I shot that cannon against that hotel. The Russians made a loud complaint, and the United Nations and so on, that they had been attacked, and sure enough, the presence of the Russians was well known at the time because of that incident.
fellow citizens, this government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
For 13 days, the world nervously waited. Would the missile crisis end with nuclear war? But Kennedy and Khrushchev resorted to diplomacy instead. The Soviet Union would withdraw its missiles from Cuba, Kennedy would remove U.S. missiles from Turkey, and not invade Cuba.
Despite what President Kennedy had promised to Khrushchev on agreeing to get the missiles out of Cuba, we suddenly were found again, a new boss came in, and we were back in action again to get rid of Castro and the Castro regime. And it was during this period that we ended up in what was called the autonomous groups to involve operations against Cuba. Provide money and material in any way to these groups. Do not try to direct them. Do not try to tell them what to do. And do not ask them what they're doing. The Cubans were going to run their own operations, and they did. And it was a disaster.
Doctor Boch, ¿de dónde partió el avión para el bombardeo?
El avión partió, Manolo, de una base secreta. Y los tripulantes eran 3, un piloto y 2 bombarderos.
We did about 9 bombing. Of course, the bomber never fall in the right place.
We did one thing on material. We told them where to buy their weapons and not get rooked.
By the mid-1960s, the CIA officials had left Miami. But the culture of violence they had nurtured remained and spread to New York City as well.
De países latinoamericanos contra nuestra revolución. En otros, más tristes aún,
Me lo dijo el inspector Bianco. You are going to be assassinated at any moment. Con esas palabras es que me recibió la ciudad de Nueva York. Desde ese día hasta el último existieron esos planes, y aquí aparece un informe del año 68 y otro informe del año 76. Aquí están los nombres: José Dionisio Suárez. Guillermo Novo hizo una carrera completa de su vida tratando de matarme, porque del 66 hasta el 78, según el FBI. Una vez iban a disparar desde el puente Queens, que quedaba enfrente de mi apartamento, con un fusil de mirilla telescópica, que ellos saben que lo tenían, aquí lo dicen. ¿Tú sabes cuánto les costó el fusil? $120. Mira lo que vale la cabeza de un embajador en Estados Unidos.
What happened was that these people found themselves no longer in the center. They began to be pushed to the fringe.
We prefer to destroy Cuba than a communist Cuba.
And the further away they got, they began, at some point in time, they just began to morph into regular criminals.
They are the children who were raised in the 20s and 30s and 40s and saw political gangsterism as a means to money and to power. Some of them were politically illiterate.
It's the old story of give to the anti-Castro freedom movement or suffer the consequences.
Did you receive any threats prior to the explosion?
Yes, yesterday a man called to my mother's home telling that they belong to the secret army and I need to give to those people the same amount of money that I paid in taxes the last year.
A third device, unexploded, containing omega-7 decals, was discovered outside the offices of Replica magazine, also a target of earlier attacks.
To overthrow Castro in Havana, you place a bomb in Miami. It is not a real logic.
Max Lesnick became very controversial back in the exile community when he got involved with a small movement advocating talking to Castro and trying to get Cuba open, which of course in Miami was heresy, almost a death sentence.
Precisamente un jefe policíaco una vez me dijo, usted no debiera estar vivo, de acuerdo con los reportes policíacos que tenía en su mano. Y yo creo que si estoy vivo es por suerte, porque intentos de asesinato hubo muchos.
My father always said, I remember even as a small child saying he never feared debating somebody who was a radical or a communist. He only feared not being allowed to debate. So my father did not cooperate with the terrorists and repudiated the dictatorship in Cuba. It was a moral position to take, but it also made him a target for the extremists. And on April 30th of 1976, he was a victim of a terrorist attack that cost him both his legs and nearly his life.
But I will walk again. I will be on my feet again, okay?
He says it's a small price to pay. If it takes his legs, if he lost his legs, as long as the people who did it get caught.
And I think some of these terrorist elements that eventually tried to assassinate him realized that with this guy on the radio, you know, this guy was going to be a problem. I mean, he's really condemning us and exposing us for what we are.
Captain, there seems to be just an unusual amount of bombings in Dade County over the past few years. What's been the record here?
Our biggest year is back in 1968. We had 44 bombings. This year, so far, we've had 23.
I think at one point in the 1970s, Miami was having more bombings than you would find in Belfast or in Beirut.
They even bombed federal institutions during the peak period of terrorism in Miami. One of the bombs they placed here back in the late 70s was at the FBI office.
That was as a message to the U.S. government saying, wait a minute, we're on your side, we're your people, and now you're persecuting us. We heard that a lot.
The explosion was actually on the south side, outside of the hotel.
An organization known as the Luis Boitel Commandos
communist group El Condor claimed credit. The bomb exploded shortly after midnight.
The explosion was so loud.
A medida que se acercan las elecciones presidenciales, el actual gobierno de los Estados Unidos no ha logrado solventar las consecuencias de la recesión económica.
After college, I moved back home. Not that I wasn't ready to move out just yet. I didn't have a job lined up.
Tampoco los medios hablan de sus secuelas. En esta edición, USA de verdad, la cruda realidad de las tasas. Una opción laboral a consecuencia de la crisis económica. Un pueblo clama por ser escuchado. USA de verdad, este lunes, solo por TeleSUR.
Carlos Muñiz was assassinated in front of his son. When Carlos died, the San Juan police did an autopsy of his destroyed head. Well, someone took a photo of this and sent it to my daughter, who was 9 years old. It was mailed to her, her name. It said, Toys R Us from San Juan, Puerto Rico. And it said, your father is next.
In this war against communists, a lot of innocents have been sacrificed, and we know some more has to be if we want to make the victory, the final victory.
No había ninguna diferencia entre lo que hacían los italianos de los años 20 y 30 en Little Italy a lo que los cubanos de la derecha hicieron en Little Havana. Terrorismo para imponer su voluntad y silenciar las voces discrepantes.
The violent exiles carried out dozens of attempts in Miami, New York, New Jersey, and Puerto Rico. But their main target remained the same and elusive.
Maurice Bicho me lo dijo, de que Castro iba a Chile. Y entonces yo viajé a Miami en varias oportunidades para buscar un personal que se comprometiera a hacer el atentado. Estuvieron entrenándose en Venezuela como camarógrafos para poder conseguir las credenciales como periodistas. Que se dieron cuenta que la labor era muy difícil, que le iba a costar la vida, y decidieron no jugarse la vida que se habían comprometido.
Maurice Bishop then informed Veciana that Castro was planning a visit to Quito, Ecuador, on his way home to Cuba. Veciana contacted Luis Posada Carriles, a former Batista policeman and well-known anti-Castro militant, to assassinate Castro.
Castro era una figura alta que sobresalía. Y él dice, yo estoy seguro que yo le puedo poner el tiro en la frente a él, pero quiero la garantía para poder escapar. Fracasó el plan.
Killing Fidel apparently loomed as too forbidding a task for most violent exiles, so they attacked a film about him. In 1969, public television showed a film I did on Castro in Cuba. In 1970, that film was supposed to show in a theater in New York City, but some bombs exploded in the theater.
We were scheduled to show Saul Landau's film called Fidel, which to this day I think probably inspired the action, shall we say. So the window fell in on me.
3 personas salieron del centro 10 minutos antes la bomba.
¿Había alguien en el centro cuando explotó la bomba?
Sí, yo, sí.
I found it very difficult to believe, not so much that people wouldn't do this, but that our government wouldn't do anything about it. I think that was very scary to me.
On September 19th, 1976, I had dinner with Orlando Letelier at his house. Letelier was a former Chilean ambassador to Washington, and I had invited him to work with me at the Institute for Policy Studies. After dinner, we went outside, and I put my elbows on the hood of his car, not suspecting there was a bomb planted in it. 36 hours later, Letelier drove to work with a colleague, Ronnie Moffett. Letelier died in the explosion, as did Ronnie Moffett. Shortly afterwards, the FBI arrested Jose Dionisio Suarez and Guillermo Novo, the very men they had listed in their assassination report on Ricardo Alarcón. 2 weeks later, international terrorism took on new dimensions.
We had an explosion and we are descending immediately. We had fire on board.
UNO 455, we return to the field.
The time is 1724. Okay, Silver, Cubana 455. We are requesting immediately landing. Cierre la puerta, cierre la puerta.
This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. 9 days ago, a Cuban passenger jet en route from Barbados to Havana crashed into the sea following an onboard explosion. 73 persons, 57 of them Cuban, were killed.
Se detuvo a los cubanos Orlando Bosch y Luis Posada Carriles como autores intelectuales del atentado.
No voy a decir, como dicen ustedes los americanos, no comento.
The CIA was told that a Cuban airliner was going to be hit and didn't notify the Cubans, which one could argue was criminal. And I haven't met any investigator or agent who did not believe that Luis Posada was involved in the blowing up of the Cubana airline.
Seguirá la lucha y seguirán los atentados en toda forma y manera a nuestro alcance.
I don't make the connection between innocent youths on an airplane, how it would, I mean, I have children. My children are the ages of...
I have 6 too. That's, you know how we call that? Unfortunately.
Solo 3 días después, esto hay que entenderlo bien, ¿no? De haber volado el avión cubano sobre Barbados, en el que mueren 73 personas. El centro de la CIA me preguntaban, ¿qué sabe del viaje de Fidel Castro a Angola? Porque era el aniversario de la independencia de ese país. Se suponía que Fidel iba a viajar. Ya estaban fraguando la posibilidad de asesinar a Fidel en su posible viaje a Angola.
Some exiles used the bombing of the Cubana plane over Barbados to raise money for their own cause, which was more violence against Cuban targets in the United States.
I received a call from the mission. By the radio, they're saying that they killed a Cuban diplomat in Queens Boulevard on the 46. The one that had been killed was Felix. I took the car and went to the place. I touched him, it was cold, completely cold.
Omega 7 says tonight's killing was an execution and warns that the next victim would be Cuban ambassador to the UN, Raul Roa.
Un día yo salía por la mañana de mi casa y el escolta me dijo, embajador, hay una cajita negra allí que yo puse al lado del arbolito que pudiera ser una bomba. El conserje de la casa de enfrente, donde estaba el arbolito, decidió que esa caja no tenía por qué estar en el arbolito de su edificio, sino que debía estar en el arbolito de mi casa. Y lo llevó, cruzó, cogió la cajita negra y la puso en un arbolito al lado de mi casa. Cuando llegó el técnico en explosivos, le dijo, ¿dónde está la cajita? Y se la acaban de llevar el camión de la basura.
So the driver of the truck took the bomb because he thought that it was a radio or something valuable. You know, every time they see something of value in the trash, they separate it for them.
El camión ya había avanzado 2 cuadras y estaba en el momento en que llegó nuestro técnico en explosivos, estaba frente a la embajada de Venezuela.
So when we arrived, we went to the truck. There was the driver. I was with Wilfredo. I asked him, did you pick up something like this and that? Said, yes, but that's mine. That's mine. If you lose it, I'm sorry, but this is for me. Listen, that's a bomb. No. You are kidding. That's not a bomb. I said, listen, does it have some magnet? Yes. Could you please put it in the door of the truck? When he placed the magnet in the door of the truck and he saw that this device stays there, he opened the door and started running.
Well, the time has come. You've seen the map. Reagan is our projected winner, Ronald Wilson Reagan.
Ronald Reagan's re-election provided greater impetus for the political plans of anti-Castro exiles in Florida. Having understood that violence alone could not bring down the Cuban government, Jorge Mascanosa founded the Cuban American National Foundation with political action committees and lobbyists. With Reagan's support, Mascanosa encouraged Cuban Americans who shared his agenda to run successfully for Congress.
We are really the voice of the Cuban American community in Miami, and we hope to convey to all the fellow Anglos our feelings about communism and why we're here in this country.
I called Bob Mueller. Mueller was in charge of security of the U.S. mission to the UN. Listen, is Mr. Garcia from the Cuban mission to the UN. He said, I'm sorry, Mr. Mueller is not here. He said, listen, if a Cuban is calling the head of security of the U.S. mission to the UN on a Saturday, don't you think it's important? Yes, I think it's important. So Mueller called me. I said, listen, Mueller, I have to see you immediately. I have some information I have to give to you. Listen, Nestor, today my son is going to pitch a game of the Little League. I have to stay with him. I said, listen, Mueller, leave your son. And Mueller arrived more or less in an hour and a half. It better be good, Nestor. I said, okay, sit down, Mueller, please. It's going to be good, please, sit down. He sat down and I said, well, write what I'm going to tell you. Attempt against the life of President Ronald Reagan. Reagan was going to visit Carolina, and they're going to kill him during that visit. Two or 3 days later, I was in Grand Central Station looking for the papers of Carolina, and there was a news that a group of people has been caught with some kind of weapon that has no license for that kind of weapon, that they went to jail, something like that. Later, Mueller told me that please tell the Cuban government that my government appreciate very much the information they give us about the attempt against the life of Ronald Reagan. There was no change, only they say thanks, and that's all. Business as usual.
What's happening in Cuba is not a failure of the Cuban people, it's a failure of Fidel Castro and of communism.